Imagine this. It's late at night. The cabin lights dim. The sound of engines steady as a heartbeat. You're somewhere high above the South China Sea, cruising through darkness at over 500 miles an hour. It's supposed to be a routine flight, a simple overnight journey that thousands of people make every single day. But this one is different, because tonight, in the early hours of March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, carrying 239 people, will vanish into the void. No distress call, no confirmed wreckage, no answers. What happened on that night has become one of the greatest mysteries in modern aviation. The flight took off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport at 12:41 a.m. local time. Its destination, Beijing Capital International Airport. On board were 227 passengers and 12 crew members, people from 15 different countries, each with their own stories, their own reasons for boarding that plane. Some were tourists heading home after vacations. Others were business travelers heading to meetings and deals waiting in Beijing. Families, students, children, all trusting that by sunrise they would land safely at their destination. The aircraft itself was a Boeing 777, one of the safest and most reliable jets in the world. Aviation experts often call it the workhorse of long-haul travel. Its safety record before this night was nearly spotless. It was the kind of plane designed to withstand lightning strikes, turbulent storms, and even serious mechanical failures. When passengers boarded Flight 370, they had every reason to believe they were safe. For the first part of the journey, everything went according to plan. The flight climbed to its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet and settled into its course. At 1:19 a.m., about 38 minutes after takeoff, the cockpit made its final routine communication with Malaysian Air Traffic Control. The voice of the co-pilot came through the radio.com and ordinary, saying, "Good night, Malaysian 370. These words would later haunt investigators, because just 2 minutes later, the plane's transponder, the system that broadcasts its location, stopped transmitting. On the radar screens of Malaysian controllers, the plane simply disappeared. At first, no one noticed. Planes vanish from secondary radar, occasionally due to technical issues, and controllers expect them to reappear as systems reconnect. But this time, it didn't happen. Minutes turned into hours. Flight 370 never arrived in Beijing. Instead, they faced silence, confusion, and eventually panic. Search and rescue operations began almost immediately. Dozens of ships, planes, and satellites were mobilized to scour the South China Sea, where the plane was last tracked. But there was nothing. No floating debris, no oil slick, no signal from emergency beacons. The sea was empty, as if the massive aircraft and everyone on board had been erased from existence. Then came the first strange discovery. Military radar data later revealed that after its transponder stopped, the plane had not crashed. Instead, it had turned sharply off course, veering westward across the Malay Peninsula. It flew back over Malaysia, then out into the Strait of Malacca. From there, it continued on an unknown path. Satellite data confirmed that for hours after the disappearance, the plane was still in the air, but the direction it took and the reason behind its silence remain a mystery. Imagine the sheer disbelief of investigators. A Boeing 777 doesn't just vanish, it can't. It's one of the largest and most advanced passenger jets in the world, loaded with redundant systems and safety protocols. Yet here was an aircraft flying without communication, tracked only by faint pings between its systems and satellites, slipping further away from where it was supposed to be. For the families of passengers, the agony was unimaginable. They were told their loved one's flight had disappeared. At first, they hoped it was a technical glitch, that the plane might have made an emergency landing somewhere remote. But as the hours turned to days and then weeks, hope began to fade. What made the pain worse was the lack of clear answers. Governments and airlines stumbled over their responses, releasing partial information that often contradicted itself. Families were left waiting in limbo, desperate for truth that never came. Because as investigators pieced together the plane's final movements, the path it may have taken led them into one of the most remote places on Earth, the southern Indian Ocean. Based on satellite data, before finally running out of fuel and plunging into the sea, the search area was massive, stretching across tens of thousands of square miles of deep ocean. But even with the largest and most expensive search in aviation history, little was found. 370. Other pieces, too, were identified. But the main wreckage, the fuselage, the black boxes, the bulk of the jet has never been discovered. It's as though the ocean swallowed it whole. And so, the mystery deepened. A deliberate act by someone on board, a hijacking that went horribly wrong. Or something else, something no one has yet imagined. Theories spread across the world, each more unsettling than the last. But in this first chapter of the story, what matters most is the vanishing itself. For those left behind, the nightmare never ends. Every unanswered question is a wound that will not heal. Every silence from officials is another reminder that the truth may never be known. Families still wait, still demand answers, still hope against hope that somehow, someday, someone will explain what happened in the dark skies that night. And as you listen to this, remember, this isn't a tale from centuries ago or some ancient ghost ship swallowed by the sea. This happened in our time, in an age of satellites, GPS, and constant surveillance. And yet, one of the largest aircraft in the world slipped away without a trace. The strange clues and the theories that followed are darker and stranger still. And we're going to walk through all of them. So if you want to keep unraveling this mystery with me, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to Belmoze, because this is just part 1 of 5, and the story only gets stranger from here. When a plane vanishes, investigators don't just look at where it went, they look at how it moved. And with Flight 370, the movement tells a chilling story. The radar data, the satellite pings, the sharp change in course, all of it pointed to one disturbing possibility. This was not an accident. This was a deliberate act. When the transponder stopped broadcasting at 1:21 a.m., the plane didn't suddenly fall from the sky. It kept flying. But without the transponder, it was invisible to civilian air traffic control. Whoever was at the controls knew that, and then came the turn, a sudden calculated bank to the left, redirecting the jet away from its flight path. It didn't wobble or drift off course the way a malfunctioning plane might. It turned smoothly, like it was following a set of instructions. For investigators, that was the first sign of intent. Modern aircraft don't make movements like that by themselves. Someone had to command it, either manually or by reprogramming the autopilot. And the deeper the investigation went, the more it appeared that this wasn't a tragic accident of failing systems. It was a choice. So the question became, whose choice? The spotlight fell on the cockpit. The captain of the flight, Zahari Ahmad Shah, was a 53-year-old veteran pilot with more than 18,000 hours of flying experience. By all accounts, he was skilled, calm, under pressure, and deeply familiar with the Boeing 777. He was also well respected among his colleagues. The co-pilot, Fariq Abdul Hamid, was 27 years old and relatively new to long-haul flights. This was one of his first times handling a Boeing 777 on an international route. He was described as ambitious, eager, and confident. Together, they were the men most capable of controlling the plane that night. Immediately, theories swirled around the possibility of a suicide mission. Aviation history already had examples of pilots who had taken their lives, and the lives of everyone on board by deliberately crashing their aircraft. Egyptair Flight 990 in 1999. Germanwings Flight 9525 in 2015. Both were cases where investigators concluded that pilots had locked others out of the cockpit and flown to their deaths. Was Flight 370 another entry in that grim record? Investigators searched Zahari's home and personal belongings. They discovered a flight simulator where he had practiced unusual routes, including one that eerily mirrored the suspected path into the Indian Ocean. That discovery fueled speculation, making it seem like he may have rehearsed the disappearance. But there was a catch. The data was incomplete, fragments from many different practice sessions. There was no way to prove it was a rehearsal, or even intentional. On top of that, people who knew Zahari spoke out against the theory. Friends and family described him as warm, funny, and devoted. He had no known financial problems, no history of violence, and no evidence of radical beliefs. His marriage was troubled, but nothing investigators uncovered suggested he was about to commit mass murder. The case against him was circumstantial, built on possibilities, not proof. The co-pilot, Fariq, also faced scrutiny. He was young and inexperienced compared to Zahari. Some pointed to earlier reports that he had once invited passengers into the cockpit of another flight, suggesting recklessness. But there was no evidence linking him to sabotage or suicide. His family, like Zahari's, rejected the idea outright. If not the pilots, then maybe hijackers. That theory seemed plausible in the early days. Terrorist groups had hijacked planes before, and in 2014, the memory of 9/11s was still raw. Within hours of the disappearance, intelligence agencies around the world scrambled to check if extremist groups had claimed responsibility. But days passed, then weeks, with silence. No group stepped forward, and as more details emerged, the hijacking theory grew weaker. Hijackers usually make demands: political concessions, prisoner exchanges, ransoms. But with Flight 370, there were no calls, no threats, no demands. Whoever took control of the plane, if it wasn't the pilots, didn't seem interested in using it as leverage. Instead, the flight vanished into the most remote part of the planet, as if the goal wasn't to make a statement, but to erase it completely. Still, the deliberate act theory persisted, strengthened by technical details. One key clue was the controlled altitude changes during the flight. Radar data showed the plane climbed to an unusually high altitude, possibly as high as 45,000 feet. Shortly after turning off course, at that altitude, the oxygen levels thinned dangerously, and without supplemental oxygen, passengers and crew would lose consciousness in minutes. Was this a maneuver to incapacitate everyone on board? If so, it would explain why there were no phone calls, no text messages, no frantic attempts at communication from the passengers. On other doomed flights, even in the last moments, people managed to send messages. On Flight 370, there was nothing. Silence. If that theory is true, it means the cabin was deliberately depressurized, leaving only the person in control, conscious with an oxygen mask. That person would have had hours to fly the plane into isolation, uninterrupted, chilling, yes, but consistent with the data. But there's another possibility. What if it wasn't just one person? What if this was a coordinated act involving both pilots, or someone else entirely who managed to gain access to the cockpit? That question remains unanswered because of one haunting fact. The black boxes, the cockpit voice recorder, and flight data recorder were never recovered. Those devices could have told investigators exactly what happened in those critical moments. Without them, everything is speculation. For families, the deliberate act theory was one of the hardest to accept. It meant their loved ones didn't die from chance or error, but from choice. A choice made by a human being. That reality, if true, is harder to live with than the randomness of an accident. Some relatives of passengers still believe in alternative explanations, clinging to the possibility that something else happened, something less cruel, less deliberate. Yet the data doesn't lie. The transponder was switched off. The plane turned off course. It flew for hours into one of the most remote regions of the planet. These aren't the marks of a sudden mechanical failure or an accidental disaster. These are signs of human hands at the controls, guiding it step by step into disappearance. The theory of a deliberate act doesn't provide closure. It only raises more questions. Who was responsible? Why did they do it? Was it planned meticulously, or was it a desperate decision made in the middle of the night? And most frustrating of all, will we ever know for sure? As the investigation moved forward, other theories emerged. Some focused on mechanical failure, others on catastrophic fire, and still others on shadowy conspiracies involving governments and cover-ups. But the idea of a deliberate act has remained one of the strongest because of the evidence of choice in the plane's movements. Flight 370 wasn't a ghost ship drifting helplessly across the skies. It was flown, and that fact alone makes the story of its disappearance one of the most chilling mysteries in aviation history. When planes vanish, the mind often leaps to foul play. But sometimes, the simplest explanation is the most terrifying one, that the technology failed. That in the dead of night, in one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. Flight 370 was undone, not by human intent, but by mechanical catastrophe. This theory begins with the understanding that modern planes, even as advanced as the Boeing 777, are not invincible. They are machines, and like all machines, they have weaknesses. Electrical systems can short, hydraulic lines can rupture, fires can start in places impossible to reach, and sometimes those failures happen at the worst possible moment, giving a crew no chance to respond. One of the most commonly proposed scenarios is a fire. Imagine the cockpit at 1:20 a.m., dark skies outside, silence in the cabin, and suddenly the smell of burning. It could have been an electrical short, a failure in the avionics bay beneath the cockpit, or even overheating batteries, a known risk in aviation. Their first move would not have been to radio for help. It would have been to fight the fire to keep the plane in the air. That's why, in aviation disasters, distress calls are sometimes never made. Pilots in crisis focus first on saving the aircraft. But what if the fire disabled their communications? A blaze in the avionics could have knocked out the transponder, cutting the plane off from civilian radar. It could also have filled the cockpit with smoke, forcing the pilots to wear oxygen masks, if the fire grew out of control, or if toxic fumes spread through the cabin. The crew and passengers might have been incapacitated within minutes. That possibility aligns with one of the great mysteries of Flight 370, the silence. No Mayday call, no texts, no phone calls from passengers, just silence. If smoke or decompression knocked everyone unconscious quickly, the plane could have flown on autopilot, a ghost ship in the sky, until it exhausted its fuel and fell into the Indian Ocean. Another version of the failure theory points to sudden decompression. If the fuselage cracked at cruising altitude, oxygen levels would plummet. At 35,000 feet, hypoxia, a lack of oxygen, takes hold within seconds. Passengers would have slipped into unconsciousness without even realizing it. The pilots, equipped with oxygen masks, would have had a little more time. But if systems were damaged, if masks failed, or if the decompression was severe, they too might have lost consciousness. The plane, still intact, would have continued on, guided only by autopilot, until fuel starvation brought it down. There's precedent for this. In 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 suffered a pressurization failure. The crew lost consciousness, and the plane flew on autopilot for hours before running out of fuel and crashing in Greece. Everyone on board died, not from the crash itself, but from the lack of oxygen long before. MH370 could have followed the same tragic script, only over the vast emptiness of the Indian Ocean. Skeptics of the deliberate act theory point to these precedents as more likely explanations. After all, catastrophic mechanical failure doesn't require a motive. It doesn't require conspiracy. It requires only chance, bad luck, and timing. A fire, a rupture, or a malfunction at altitude could explain everything we know: the silence, the long flight path, and the final crash. But there are cracks in this theory too. If the failure was sudden and catastrophic, how do we explain the deliberate course changes? A decompression or fire would not make a plane turn smoothly back across Malaysia and then out into the Indian Ocean. That movement suggests conscious control, not chaos. Unless, and this is key, the pilots initially tried to turn back to safety. Imagine this scenario. A fire breaks out, filling the cockpit with smoke. The captain executes a sharp turn toward Penang, his hometown, possibly aiming for an emergency landing. But as the fire spreads, it disables the radios, silences the transponder, and eventually overwhelms the crew. The plane, programmed to fly a heading, continues on, unnoticed in the night, until its tanks run dry. This hybrid theory, part mechanical failure, part human attempt to save the plane, is one of the most discussed among experts. It explains both the deliberate turn and the eventual silence. It paints a picture not of foul play, but of tragedy, where skilled pilots fought desperately to save their aircraft and passengers, but were defeated by forces beyond their control. There's another angle: the lithium batteries. The cargo manifest of Flight 370 included more than 400 pounds of lithium-ion batteries. These are notoriously volatile, prone to overheating and catching fire. Several aviation accidents have been linked to lithium battery fires in cargo holds. If those batteries ignited mid-flight, the consequences could have been devastating. Thick smoke could have filled the cabin. Fumes could have incapacitated passengers, and the pilots, blinded and choking, might have tried to divert, but failed to keep control long enough. It's a haunting possibility, especially because it places the cause not in human hands, but in cargo loaded just hours before takeoff. If true, it means the fate of 239 people was sealed before the plane even left the runway, yet even this explanation leaves gaps. If the fire was severe enough to disable communication, how did the plane remain in the air for so long? Fires tend to destroy aircraft quickly. Could it have burned out early, leaving a crippled but flyable plane? Or was it something else entirely, a failure no one has yet imagined? This is what makes MH370 so baffling. Each theory answers some questions but leaves others hanging. A catastrophic failure explains the silence, the ghost flight, and the lack of distress calls, but it struggles with the long controlled deviations from the flight path. Deliberate action explains the turns but struggles with the silence of the passengers. The truth may lie in a gray area between them. For the families of the missing, the mechanical failure theory carries a different weight than the deliberate act. It offers the faint comfort that their loved ones were victims of chance, not of malice. That their final moments, if they even knew them, were swift. Unconsciousness in seconds, not terror over hours. But comfort doesn't erase the questions, and the lack of wreckage leaves even this theory as speculation. The haunting part is how normal everything seemed before it all went wrong. Routine communication, stable flight, calm skies, then a sudden disappearance. If a fire or decompression occurred, it happened in an instant, changing a routine journey into one of history's greatest mysteries. Flight 370 challenges our faith in technology. We believe modern planes cannot simply vanish, that every system has a safeguard, every disaster a backup. But what if they don't? What if on that night, failure stacked upon failure until even the best trained pilots couldn't save the aircraft? That idea is terrifying because it suggests it could happen again. And so, the catastrophic mechanical failure theory remains one of the strongest. Not because it explains everything perfectly, but because it doesn't require hidden motives or elaborate plots. It requires only the reality that sometimes machines fail, and when they do, the consequences are unforgiving. One of the most unsettling aspects of the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 is the strange lack of debris. When an aircraft of this size goes down, the expectation is that wreckage will be scattered across the ocean surface, visible to satellites, search aircraft, and naval vessels. This is not speculation, but an established fact of aviation history. In previous crashes, whether in the middle of the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, or closer to land, wreckage has been found within hours or days. Seat cushions, life jackets, luggage, wing fragments, and fuel slicks normally tell the story of where a plane met its end. Yet for Flight 370, a jet weighing hundreds of tons and carrying 239 people, the ocean seemed to swallow it whole, leaving behind almost nothing. The scale of the search effort makes this absence even harder to understand. At its peak, it became the largest and most expensive search in aviation history. Over 24 nations contributed resources. Satellites were tasked to scan vast stretches of the Indian Ocean. Ships from multiple navies used sonar to map the ocean floor in high detail. Specialized aircraft flew back and forth grid patterns for months. Search teams covered millions of square miles of ocean, focusing first on the South China Sea, where the plane was last officially seen, and later shifting to the southern Indian Ocean, where satellite data suggested it might have traveled. Despite this enormous effort, days turned to weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. With no wreckage to confirm where the plane went down, only after more than a year did the first confirmed piece of debris appear. In July 2015, a fragment of the wing known as a flaperon washed ashore. On Island, a French territory east of Madagascar, the flaperon was carefully examined and verified as part of Flight 370. This discovery gave investigators a grim confirmation that the plane had indeed crashed into the ocean. Yet, it also deepened the mystery, because the location of the find was thousands of miles from the search zones that had been combed with precision. How could a heavy piece of the aircraft end up there, while the main wreckage remained hidden? The ocean currents offer one explanation. The southern Indian Ocean is notorious for its vast, shifting JRs and unpredictable drift patterns. If the plane did indeed go down somewhere west of Australia, currents could, over months and years, carry lighter debris across enormous distances, eventually depositing them on beaches in Africa or on scattered islands. And in fact, more fragments followed. Parts of the plane's interior, some pieces of the engine cowling, and other sections of the wing were later discovered in places like Mozambique, Tanzania, and Mauritius. Each time a new piece surfaced, it reignited public interest in the case, while also frustrating investigators, because the debris was too dispersed and too weathered by the sea to reveal the exact crash site. Yet, even with these scattered discoveries, the central question remained: why was so little found? A Boeing 777 is not a small machine. Its wingspan alone is over 200 feet, and its empty weight is nearly 300,000 pounds. While much of its body is made of lightweight materials designed to sink quickly in water, other parts, such as seat cushions, life vests, and floating panels are designed specifically to float. Aviation experts have pointed out that when Air France Flight 447 crashed into the Atlantic in 2009, debris was visible within 48 hours, and more than 600 pieces were eventually recovered. The contrast with MH370 could not be more stark. This absence has given rise to a host of theories. Some argue that the plane may have entered the water at a steep angle, breaking apart less violently and allowing much of it to sink quickly, with minimal floating wreckage. Others suggest that weather patterns or remote geography played a role, carrying debris far from populated coastlines where it might otherwise have been found. Still, to many observers, the fact that so little surfaced is suspicious. Could the plane have crashed in an area not thoroughly searched, or in a part of the ocean where currents quickly pulled everything away from the main wreckage zone? Or, more conspiratorially, could it have been deliberately concealed? The families of the victims were among the most vocal in pointing out these inconsistencies. For them, the lack of debris was not just a scientific puzzle but a painful void, prolonging their uncertainty. Without clear evidence of what happened, without physical proof of where their loved ones' final moments occurred, closure remained out of reach. For every new piece of wreckage that washed up, families were forced to relive the grief, balancing fragile hope with crushing reality. Oceanographers have since conducted studies using drift models and satellite-tracked buoys. Attempting to trace backward from the locations where debris was found, these studies suggest that the most likely crash site lies along a stretch of ocean west of Australia, in a remote and hostile region far from shipping lanes. But the ocean is vast and unforgiving. The seafloor there is rugged, with deep trenches and towering undersea mountains. Mapping it thoroughly is a Herculean task, and despite years of work, only a fraction of it has been covered in the detail required to locate an aircraft. The sheer emptiness of the Indian Ocean compounds the mystery. Unlike the North Atlantic, where shipping traffic is dense and coastlines are relatively close, the southern Indian Ocean is a desert of water. A plane could go down there and disappear almost entirely, leaving only traces that emerge years later on distant shores. And in the case of MH370, that seems to be exactly what happened. But for investigators, exactly what happened is still not enough. The lack of debris means the lack of answers. Without the main fuselage, without the cockpit voice recorder or the flight data recorder, the story of Flight 370 remains locked away at the bottom of the ocean. Each year that passes without discovery makes the task harder, as shifting currents erase the evidence and technology races to keep up with the challenge. For the world, the lack of debris is the most haunting symbol of the mystery. It represents not only the physical absence of the plane, but also the absence of certainty, the absence of truth. A massive aircraft vanished, and the ocean returned almost nothing to explain why. For the families, for the investigators, and for those who still follow this story, the silence of the sea is deafening. It is a reminder that in the age of satellites and global connectivity, it is still possible for something enormous to vanish, leaving behind only questions and fragments scattered like whispers across distant shores. The disappearance of Malaysia Airlines. Flight 370 is more than just an aviation mystery. It has become one of the most haunting and enduring enigmas of the modern era. The lack of answers has left the victims' families suspended in a painful state of limbo, where grief cannot find closure and hope cannot fully fade. Every unexplained detail fuels speculation, and every fragment of wreckage only deepens the shadows of uncertainty. This is not just about a plane. It is about 239 people who boarded a flight expecting an ordinary journey and a world that has been unable to explain what happened next. For the families, the unanswered questions are a constant weight. Imagine sending a loved one on a routine flight and then hearing that the plane had vanished from the sky, with no trace, no final message, no clear explanation. In the days following March 8, 2014, relatives gathered in airports and hotels, clinging to the possibility that their loved ones might still be alive. Rumors spread that the plane had landed secretly, or that the passengers were being held somewhere. But as time dragged on, hope eroded. Without wreckage, without bodies, many families found themselves stuck in a cruel limbo between mourning and waiting. Even when pieces of debris washed ashore, they offered little comfort, because they confirmed a loss but did not explain it. This silence created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed theories, some grounded in aviation science, others far more speculative. Some believed that the disappearance was the act of a rogue pilot, perhaps Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, deliberately diverting the plane before carrying out a planned suicide. Others countered that there was no clear motive, and no evidence ever proved he intended such a thing. Mechanical failure was another explanation, suggesting a sudden fire, electrical failure, or depressurization that incapacitated the crew. Yet the absence of distress calls and the deliberate diversion of the plane's route made this theory incomplete. Beyond these mainstream theories, darker ideas emerged. Some suggested a hijacking, not by one person, but by a group. Was it terrorists who wanted to use the plane for another attack, only to fail and crash in the ocean? Or was it something more complex, perhaps involving state actors? Conspiracy theories blossomed, pointing fingers at governments and intelligence agencies. Some claimed that MH370 was shot down, either by accident or to prevent it from reaching a sensitive target. Others whispered that it was captured and hidden away, with the passengers silenced forever. The reality is that none of these theories explain every strange detail. The deliberate disabling of the transponder suggests human involvement. The rerouting of the plane suggests intent, yet the lack of wreckage, the silence of communication, and the absence of a clear motive leave gaping holes in every scenario. Aviation is a field where mysteries are usually solved. Black boxes are recovered, wreckage is mapped, timelines are reconstructed, and conclusions are drawn. That is why Flight 370 feels so chilling. It resists explanation. Even after the most exhaustive investigation in aviation history, the global fascination with this case shows how deeply it has embedded itself in the public imagination. Documentaries, books, and countless articles continue to revisit the mystery. People follow the story not only because of its tragedy, but because it challenges our belief in technology and control. In an age of satellites, GPS, and constant surveillance, how can a massive jetliner simply vanish? The question itself unsettles us because it suggests vulnerabilities we would rather not face. If MH370 can disappear, then so too can the sense of certainty we place in modern systems. The enduring mystery also speaks to the power of the ocean itself. The southern Indian Ocean is one of the most remote, inhospitable places on Earth. Its depths are largely unmapped. Its currents are vast and unpredictable, and its storms are merciless. Even with billions of dollars in resources, fleets of ships, and the best technology available, the sea has kept its secret. The idea that the ocean can hide something so large for so long adds an almost mythical quality to the story, turning it into a modern ghost tale of the deep. For the families, however, this is no myth. It is a daily wound. Many continue to campaign for new searches, unwilling to let the case fade into history. They hold vigils, release statements, and pressure governments to keep looking. Their fight is a reminder that behind every theory and every piece of speculation are real lives: mothers, fathers, children, colleagues, and friends gone without explanation. The haunting nature of this story lies in its incompleteness. We know just enough to be sure of tragedy, but not enough to tell the full story. The fragments of wreckage prove the plane met its end in the ocean, but they do not reveal how or why. The satellite data gives us a possible path, but not an exact crash site. The theories provide glimpses of possibility, but no certainty. And so, Flight 370 remains suspended between fact and mystery, a riddle that resists solution. Perhaps one day, new technology, or a stroke of luck, will uncover the wreckage and finally tell us what happened. Perhaps the black boxes will reveal the final moments of the flight, or perhaps the ocean will hold its secret forever, and MH370 will remain one of the great mysteries of the 21st century. For now, what endures is the haunting absence of truth, the pain of unanswered questions, and the uneasy awareness that some mysteries may never be solved. This is the haunting and enduring mystery of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. A plane vanished into the night, and more than a decade later, we are still searching for answers. The story has no ending, only silence, fragments, and questions that echo across the ocean. If you found this deep dive into the disappearance of MH370 compelling, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts or theories, and subscribe to Belmoze for more stories that explore the world's darkest mysteries. Your support helps us continue bringing these haunting tales to light.